Chapter 60. This venerable one discovers a secret. Boosted by the spells cast upon it, the ferry travelled quickly. By the next morning, they had reached the port of Yangju. Envoys were at the harbour to receive them, with well-bred horses at the ready. The party ate breakfast at the harbour, but since the feathered tribe didn't require sustenance, their escorts sat by the edge of the harbour, with their eyes closed, to rest their spirits. Dawn had only just broken, and there weren't many merchants around conducting business. Conversely, the deckhands had risen, and they gathered in threes and fives to chow down on porridge and steamed buns, as well as to peek and steal curious glances at the newcomers from time to time. As these beefy fellows in simple labourers' garb chewed their meals, bits and pieces of their conversation fell upon Moran's ears. "Oh hey, I recognize their clothes. They're people of the lower cultivation realm. The lower cultivation realm is so far away, and they don't interact much with the sects from this area, so how would you know? Just look at the emblem of the Vambrances. Isn't it exactly the same as the one on the Holy Night Guardian? You mean one of those wooden devices that repel evil?" One fellow crunched on pickles as he peered at Zhuo Meng's sleeve. "Ayo, that's right," he exclaimed. "Who was the one who made the Holy Night Guardian again?" "I heard it was the Yuheng Elder of Xisheng Peak." "Who's the Yuheng Elder? Is he as powerful as our Guyue sect leader Zhang?" "Heh, who knows? Who's to say anything about the world of cultivators?" The deckhands spoke in a heavy Sioux dialect, and Moran couldn't quite comprehend them, but Chuaning understood what these people were saying. When he heard that his invention, the Holy Night Guardian, was being successfully distributed throughout the common world, he could only feel comforted. It made him start thinking about the future. After they returned, he would work on prototypes for lighter wheelbarrows that were easier to use and thereby do more good. Once breakfast was done, the group left with haste. Not 4 hours later, they reached the foot of Mount Jihua. It was still early in the day, and the winter sun had only just reached its zenith. Millions of threads of golden light came kissing down from it like silk. They imbued the snowy summit with a crystalline luminescence, making it glitter magnificently. Upon the slopes of the peak were hundreds of luscious ancient pines that remained evergreen. Each stood resolutely in the frost, much like a hermit cultivator, with an immortal air, sleeves lowered and eyes half-lidded, deadly silent where they towered on either side of the mountain path. It wasn't for nothing that the mortals called the summit of Mount Jihua the unmortal world. At the foot of the mountain, the envoys of the feathered tribe whistled thrice. At the sound, a little golden sparrow with vibrantly charming feathers flew out of the white, snowy scenery and landed lightly before them. The group followed the sparrow's lead, heading west the entire way, until they came to the curtain of a turbulent, tempestuous waterfall. "Will the Xianshun please step back?" The leader of the feathered tribe envoys stood at the fore, her hand imitating the hand of Buddha, and she silently recited a spell. Then she pursed her scarlet lips and gently blew into the wind. A shocking beam of flames appeared in mid-air and streaked towards the waterfall, where it divided the water curtain in half. The women of the feathered tribe breezily turned around and smiled. "We cordially invite you to enter Peach Blossom Springs." They followed their escorts and passed through the barrier. After crossing it, the scenery before their eyes suddenly brightened. The scene before them was vast, with no end in sight, as if it was an entirely different world, one filled with pink blossoms. Peach Blossom Springs was a sheltered land with few connections to the cultivation world. While it couldn't be compared to the real land of immortals, much less spoken of as its equal, it was nonetheless rich with spiritual energy. The scenery within the springs looked as if it had come out of a painting, its colors elegant and delicate. After walking for a while, the group realized that here, The 4 seasons seemed to change and blend into one another in a manner wholly unlike they did in their own world. With the women of the feathered tribe leading the way, they first passed through a wilderness where the sound of coursing rivers roared in their ears, accompanied by the cries of monkeys coming from both shores. Then they approached the outskirts of a city and saw vast farmlands of crisscrossing field paths where wheat swayed in the breeze. Finally, once they had entered the city fortress, they found immaculate and detailed buildings as far as the eye could see, with eaves both tall and grand. The capital of Peach Blossom Springs was magnificent and beautiful, and in terms of size and amenities, it was comparable to the lively city centers of the mortal realm. The only differences lay in the spring petals and drifting snowflakes that danced together overhead, the blue birds and white cranes that took flight together in flocks, and the passing folk of the feathered tribe. These beautiful people carried themselves with ethereal grace, flowing and picturesque, and every one of them looked like an otherworldly celestial who had just stepped out of an illustration. However, though this was a sight that the disciples had never before beheld, they had already laid eyes on the fantastic sights of Jinshan Lake, so this was no longer quite as awe-inspiring. They came to a fork in the road and met one of the feathered tribe folk who wore a grand feathered cloak, white with gold embroidery depicting a phoenix. She stood by an ancient tree, so tall it reached the skies. The flame mark on her forehead was a much richer red than that of her peers, signaling that her powers were far greater than the rest of them. The envoys leading the way brought the group before her, then each bent one knee to the ground to bow as they greeted her. "Great immortal lord, the 4 Yangju of Xisheng Peak have come." "Thank you for your labors. You may stand down." "Understood." The beautifully dressed feathered tribe woman smiled softly, and her voice was clear and stirring, like the cry of a young phoenix. "I am called 18. By the grace of the elder immortal of my family, I was granted the grand title of Great Immortal Lord of Peach Blossom Springs. We are most thankful that my lords have been willing to show us the courtesy of coming to train in our humble abode. Should the Tianjun find their reception to be in any way inadequate during their stay here, please do forgive us and do not be afraid to let us know." Such beauty and such grace when she spoke. She certainly gave a good impression. Sure, Meng didn't like it when men were better looking than him, but he was at the age when he was beginning to become aware of the fairer sex, so naturally he didn't dislike ladies who were so beautiful that they seemed to have emerged from paintings. He smiled. "Xianzhu is too kind, but this name, 18, certainly is odd. Might I ask after Xianzhu's family name?" "I have no family name," she replied, gentle and courteous. "I am only 18. Moran laughed. "If you're called 18, then is someone here named 17? He'd meant it as a joke, but to his surprise, 18 smiled. "Xianzhen is wise. 17 is my Zizi." Moran blinked, stunned. "We of the feathered tribe are born from the fallen feathers of the vermilion bird," 18 explained. "When our cultivation was still weak, we took the forms of the crested ibis. The first to cultivate a human form was the elder immortal of my family. The rest of the feathered tribe are thus named in order of when we attained human form, starting with 1, 2, and so forth. I am the 18th, and so I am named 18. Moran had absolutely no words. He had originally thought Zhuo Chengyong was as bad as it got when it came to doling out names. Never had he expected to find someone who was even worse, let alone people who referred to themselves with numbers. Then 18 said something that left him even more thunderstruck. "Come, let's get down to business. This is your first visit to our lands, and you aren't yet familiar with the training rules of Peach Blossom Springs. In the mortal realm, cultivation has for centuries been divided by schools and sects. In this place, things are different. We of the feathered tribe have always been very clear in our division of labor. There are those who specialize in defense, those who specialize in attack, and those who specialize in healing. There are 3 divisions in all, and your training will thus also be conducted accordingly. Moran smiled. That's brilliant. 18 nodded toward him. Much appreciated, Xiao Jianjun. When the cultivators from Guiyuye, who came here several days ago, heard of this training method, they were quite displeased. Moran was mystified. Defense is defense, attack is attack, and healing is healing. Isn't such a clean split a good thing? What were they unhappy about? You see, there is a Duan Gongzi from Guiyue who belongs in defense and was thus supposed to reside with the other Tianjun of that division. However, his Shijie belongs to attack and will therefore need to train and live with the Tianjun of the attack division. While I don't quite understand the affections and relationships of mortal kind, I could tell that the Gongzi was quite unwilling to be separated from his sworn sister. What's up with that? Wait, hold up. Moran abruptly stopped laughing as realization dawned on him, his eyes wide. Not only do the different divisions train separately, they have to live about too? That's right, 18 replied, confused. She didn't understand why his expression had suddenly changed. Moran's entire face turned green. Was this some kind of bad joke? An hour later, Moran, who had failed in his bargaining with 18, stood dumbfounded before a bright and spacious little 4-sided courtyard residence and sank into a long, deep silence. Moran, Meng, and Sini belonged in the attack division and had thus been sent to the east side of Peach Blossom Springs. The east side wasn't just any small allotment of land, but the region where all the Tianjun who belonged in the attack division resided. There were more than 20 of these courtyard residences, each large enough to house 4, but there were also mountains and lakes, as well as streets and markets, built very much like the ones in the mortal realm. It seemed that because the feathered tribe knew their guests were going to live here for a long time, they had constructed these to alleviate homesickness. As for Shimei, since he belonged in the healing division, he had been sent to the south side of Peach Blossom Springs, and was exceptionally far away from where Moran and the others lived, and they were even divided by a barrier that could only be traversed with an access token. This meant that although Moran and Shimei were both within Peach Blossom Springs, they would essentially have no chance to see each other outside of daily training, for which all 3 divisions gathered to learn the basics of the feathered tribe's cultivation method. This wasn't even the worst of it. Moran looked up and eyed Meng past his thick curtain of lashes. Meng was circling the whole yard, obviously planning to pick the most comfortable residence for himself. Moran could feel the veins on his forehead pop in spite of himself. Meng. That's right, fucking hell. From today onward, he had to live in the same courtyard as Meng for the entire stay. For the next long while, he would in all likelihood have to be thoroughly steeped in 2 of the 8 great sufferings of life: separation from loved ones and the meeting of enemies. The feathered tribe had gone from the upper cultivation realm to the lower to find their chosen few, and by the time they reached Xisheng Peak, they had been at the end of their journey. Thus, those sent from the other sects had already settled in, and Meng soon discovered that one of the residences of the little 4-sided courtyard was occupied. Weird. I wonder who settled here. Meng mumbled as he glanced at the mattress cover being hung to dry in the courtyard. Whoever it is, it must not be someone who makes much of a fuss, Moran said. What do you mean? Let me ask you this. Which residence are you picking? Meng's expression grew immediately guarded. What are you planning? I've already made my choice. The one in the north that faces south is mine. If you're gonna fight me for it, then I'll... Meng hadn't yet figured out what he was going to do before Moran cut him off with a laugh. I don't like rooms that big, so I'm not fighting you for it. But here's what I wanted to ask. If this residence was still empty, he pointed at the modest abode that had already been claimed, would you swap with him? Meng gazed at that simple little thatched cottage before glaring at Moran. Do you think I'm dumb? Of course I wouldn't swap. Moran laughed. That's why I said that person isn't someone who'd make a fuss. See, when he came, all 4 residences in this courtyard were empty, but he didn't pick the best one. He chose that itty-bitty hovel. If this fellow isn't a fool, then he's a humble gentleman. Meng felt silent. This analysis certainly wasn't wrong, but he felt like his face had been ripped open by the hidden knife in Moran's smile. If this other man was a gentleman, foregoing the best residence to pick a dilapidated hut, then didn't that make Meng a stinking, vulgar, common man, a petty cheapskate? But Moran hadn't called Meng out by name, so Gongse couldn't very well yell at him. However, neither could he endure this. His entire face flushed red. Whatever the case, I'm used to living well. Meng choked out resentfully, expression dark. I can't stand for rundown accommodations, so whoever wants to be a gentleman can go right ahead. I don't care. Having made his statement, he turned and left. The 4 differently styled residences of the courtyard residence were claimed by different masters. Meng chose the exquisite residence in the north with pale walls and black shingles and a threshold lined with gold, the most luxurious abode. Moran picked the stone cottage to the west, which had a peach tree planted by the entrance, its flowers at the height of their bloom. And so, Chuaning picked the bamboo building on the east side, where the tender, gentle bamboo trees were illuminated by the setting sun to gleam with a brilliant, jade-like splendor. And on the south side was that humble, simple thatched cottage, reserved for the gentleman who they had yet to meet. Chuaning had not yet recovered from his cold, and his head still spun wickedly, so early on he excused himself to rest. Meng stayed with him for a bit, but this little shidi didn't know how to play it up and act pitiful, nor did he want to listen to stories. Instead, he only cared to wrap himself up like a small, sticky rice ball in its leaf wrapper and sleep in muffled peace. Meng sat on the edge of his bed for a bit, but eventually got bored and, dusting himself off, left. In the yard, Moran had pulled out a chair and was putting his legs up, his arms pillowed behind his head, as he watched the golden sun sink in the west, the blazing rays peeling leisurely away. When he saw Meng emerge, he asked, Is Shidi asleep now? Has his fever gone down? If you care about him, why don't you go inside and see for yourself? Moran laughed heartily. The little guy probably isn't too deeply asleep yet. My clumsiness might rouse him. Meng gave him a look. Well, at least you're aware of yourself. And here I thought you were just like Mom's cats and dogs, who only know how to idle about in the yard and be lazy. Haha, how do you know I'm being lazy? Moran twiddled a peach blossom between his fingers and looked up with a smile. The time I spent here sitting in the yard allowed me to discover a major, shocking secret. Meng obviously didn't want to ask, but he was nonetheless curious. After bearing with it for a good while, his face stiff, he worked up an expression of indifference and muttered, What major secret? Moran waved him closer and grinned. Bring your ear closer and I'll tell you in confidence. Though he was incredibly unwilling, after a long pause for consideration, Meng lowered his gracious ear. Moran leaned in close and chuckled quietly. Got you, dumb Meng. Meng's eyes went round in shock, and he exploded in outrage, seizing Moran's lapels. "You lied to me! How immature can you get?" Moran laughed. "How have I lied? I did discover a secret, but I also don't want to tell you, that's all." Sure Meng's dark brows hardened. "If I continued to believe you, then I'd truly be a fool." The two bickered like a bird pecking a dog and a dog snapping at a bird. Moran was about to teasingly say something else to provoke his cousin even further when an unknown voice came from behind them, laced with confusion. It said. "Are the two of you new trainees as well?" This man's voice was clear and crisp, smoother than that of the average youth. Moran and Sure Meng turned their heads to see a man dressed in practical, close-fitting clothing standing there against the wind, lit by the crimson blood red of the remnant sun. This fellow had a striking appearance, with inky black brows and handsome, spirited features on his honey-colored face. He wore a hair crown of black jade fastened atop his head, and though he was neither towering nor burly, he carried himself with tall, upright dignity and a noble bearing. His pair of long legs were especially noteworthy. Strapped as they were into those close-fitting trousers, they looked even more shapely and powerful, straight and gallant. Moran's expression instantly changed, and it felt like the blood and sins of a past life were flashing before his eyes. It was as if he was looking at a silhouette kneeling in a tempest of blood. The body's collarbones shot through with a steel chain, half the face's flesh ripped away. Yet this person refused to yield, willing to die rather than surrender. Moran's heart trembled like a crystal dewdrop that hung from a leaf. He couldn't describe what it was he was feeling. If there was anyone whom he had respected and admired in his previous life, then the person now standing before his eyes was definitely one of them. So, the honorable gentleman was to live with them. Was actually this fellow, huh?